Hello and welcome. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here today. In this session, we're going to share how IT security leaders in the public sector can effectively strategize to defeat today's complex cyber attacks. Our presenter will be delivering a live demo as part of today's presentation, which will appear in the media player widget on your screen. You can change the size of that media player and the slide share widget at any time during this webinar. Now, before I introduce our speaker, just a few things. Today's webinar is being recorded. We'll email you a link to view the on-demand recording shortly after the webinar concludes. We also invite your comments and questions. You'll find a Q&A widget on the left-hand side of your screen. If you think of a question at any point, type it in and we'll address this during the Q&A portion towards the end of the webinar. You can find a host of useful resources on the right-hand side of your screen. Please be sure to download a copy and review in your own time. Finally, we will not have JCAM on the webinar today as originally advertised, but we'll leave you in the expert hands of Jason Palm, our Senior Security Operations Specialist here at Fortinet. All right, Jason, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Appreciate the time today, everybody. So, quick introduction. As mentioned, my name is Jason Palm. I am a specialist on the SecOps team here at Fortinet. I've been with Fortinet for almost 4 years now. And prior to joining Fortinet, I spent many years at a large MSP where I started and ran their managed detection and response team, and also started and ran their penetration testing team. So as we have this security operations discussion today, I hope to bring my experience to bear on the conversation, both from a defense perspective and from an attack perspective. So you see here on the title screen that we've titled this Know Your Enemy, Smarter Security Operations for the Public Sector. And really, what I want to start with is a premise from ancient Chinese military treatise known as The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Essentially, as you see here, it says that if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Conversely, if you don't know the enemy, if you don't know yourself, you are going to suffer defeats. And unfortunately, it's all too common in my experience to speak with customers or security practitioners that really don't understand the enemy. In some cases, they don't even understand themselves. So what I typically like to do in presentations like this one is go behind the scenes, talk about what it truly means to know the enemy. I find that we use a lot of terminology in the field that some people just don't really understand, or we spend all of our time implementing security countermeasures, right? Learning tool sets. All of our time is spent on that front, defending against things that we hear about in the news, but may not necessarily fully understand what those things look like in practice. So what I hope to do today is go behind the scenes, take a look at operations from an attacker's perspective, and then talk about how we can use that knowledge to map our security defenses, put things into the proper context so that we can identify gaps in security and make sure that we are protected. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to jump into a live demonstration. And as Stephanie mentioned, the media player on your controls, you can resize that so that you can then see exactly what I'm doing, perhaps a little bit better. So I'm going to start by looking at a Windows 10 machine here in my lab environment. I want to draw your attention to the upper right-hand corner. The wallpaper here gives us information on this host. The name of the host is The Flame. This is a Windows 10 machine, and the username here that we see is JLock. So let's say, for example, that you've hired a new employee in your organization, someone named John Locke, and it's John's first week on the job. As John's wrapping up his work for the week, he gets a phone call from someone that tells John they're a Microsoft security technician, and they're working to supplement your security team to patch a new critical Windows vulnerability that's been discovered. They explained to John, since he's so new to the organization, he hasn't been enrolled in any kind of automated patching. So they just need a few minutes of John's time to make sure that his machine is up to date. They direct John to a website like this one, which has information on this critical Windows update. And they simply ask John to click on a link to download a Windows patch to his machine. John's happy to do so, and actually downloads a file like this one, windowsupdate.exe, to his machine, and then runs this file. Within a couple of minutes, this security technician explains to John that they can confirm that his machine is fully patched, thanks him for doing his good deed for the day, and he can go back to finishing up the work that he's doing, which he does. If I minimize the windows here, we're back to John's desktop. There's no indication here for John that anything may be wrong in this case. So he continues to access business critical applications, what have you. Now, a lot of cases that I talk to with customers, a very simple scenario like this one seems minor or trivial, but it is actual of what we see in today's attack landscape, where users are targeted, users like John are social engineered, and this could be via phishing or drive-by downloads like we just saw here. Now, there's no indication to the user that anything might be wrong, but obviously in this context, we can expect that John has done something that he shouldn't have done, right? So let's go behind the scenes and see what's actually transpired here, because there's nothing being presented to John that indicates that there is a problem, right? There's no wallpaper being displayed saying your files are encrypted or anything like that. I'm going to actually switch over to a Kali Linux machine running in my lab environment. And what you can see here is some command line information. Essentially, what we're looking at is a command and control server. You may have also heard this referenced as C2, but essentially what John did when he detonated or executed that Windows update.exe file was to allow initial access into the organization. So I'm actually running Metasploit here. This is essentially a penetration testing toolkit, and it's full of tools that an attacker can use to interact with targets. What we actually see on the screen here is information on an active session. So when John executed that, this called out to my command and control server, and then we see information from an attacker's perspective. There's John's machine, and there's John's username. Now, in a lab environment like this one, we just have this one connection, but you can imagine in a much larger campaign, for example, that an attacker might be listening to hundreds or thousands of incoming connections, right? And so they could essentially log onto the server, find a session of interest, and then start interacting with that. And that's what I'm going to do now. We see the session ID listed here as 1. So I'm going to tab this command here, sessions, then TAC-I for interactive, and then the number 1 of that session. This gives me what's called a interpreter prompt, which is essentially an attacker's command prompt. Just to give you an idea of what kind of tools I have at my disposal, I'm going to type the help command here, and I'll scroll up, and we'll just take a look at a few of the things that I have at my disposal. For example, I could start keyloggers. So logging keystrokes that a user is entering so that I can obtain further credentials, for example. I could actually start doing a screen share where I can see the user working in one of my browser windows. You also see here listed commands for webcams. The reason that we have all of those covers on our laptops these days, right? Attackers can actually start streaming from a webcam. Other commands are listed here, which we'll actually get into utilizing. So if we go back to this prompt, the first thing I would typically do as an attacker is to start understanding my target. I need to do some enumeration or some information gathering. So for example, if I use a command like this one here, get UID, this is going to tell me the user ID of the system that I'm interacting with. As we saw there, this was on John's machine, right? So I'm only acting as this user, and we see that displayed here, the Flame JLock. Furthermore, I could type a command like this one, get PID, which means process ID. And this is going to give me the process ID number of the process that I am acting on John's machine. We see here the process ID is 2708. And then if I do a PS command, this is going to list all of the running processes on John's machine. So we'll enter PS, and you can immediately see some common processes that we can identify, right? Chrome.exe, for example. And then to the far left of each of those processes is a process ID. So in that case, when I did the get PID command, my process ID was, I believe, 2708. Here it is. So 2708 is actually a process called control.exe, and it is running as that user. So a couple of problems that I have as an attacker at this point. One, I'm acting or on the machine as a suspect or abnormal process name. So if you happen to identify the processes that are typically running in your environment, this would definitely be a red flag. And then from an attacker's perspective, I'm just running as the user here, meaning that I might have limited access to some of the information on the system or within the network. So I'm going to want to change this up. What I like to do is kind of scroll up and find an early process that we can pick on here. Let's do this one here, winlogon.exe. If you look at any Windows computer, look at the running processes, you're going to see winlogon.exe running as a process on that computer. So it's a very common process. Additionally, it's also running as system, meaning that it has system level access above and beyond just what a user has access to. So I'm going to identify the process ID in this case, which is 600. I'm going to go back to my interpreter command prompt. And I'm going to use this migrate command. I'm going to say migrate 600. Essentially what I'm trying to do here is move from that 2708 control.exe process into that 600 winlogon.exe process. And we see the feedback here that says the migration completed successfully. Now, if I do my get UID command, we should see that I am now running as system. So when we start talking about tactics and techniques that attackers are using, this is exactly that. In this case, I've actually accomplished what's known as privilege escalation, meaning that instead of just running as John Locke, I'm now running a system within this environment. And if I do a get PID command, you'll see that I'm running as process ID 600. So this is a defense evasion technique as well, meaning that now I can hide in plain sight. For example, if I do that PS command to list the running processes and look for that 2708 process, previously control.exe, we'll see that it no longer exists, right? So defense evasion, privilege escalation. Now, hiding in the environment and with these escalated privileges, I can start using other commands to gain further information. For example, I'm going to use this command here, hash dump. When I run this now as system, this actually gives me all of the usernames and password hashes on John's machine, including this administrator account. We actually see this string of alphanumeric characters is the password hash, meaning that it's not the clear text password, right? But as an attacker, I can now take these hashes offline and I can start cracking these passwords. One of my favorite stories is we did a penetration test for a law firm. They were looking to just test their defense mechanisms. They had made a lot of investment in different tools and essentially wanted to see how they were doing. So they dropped us into the network on a Monday. Within 2 hours, we had full domain takeover. And we had dumped every single username and password hash in their Active Directory environment. Then by the end of that first day, we had actually cracked 75% of their user passwords, including the domain admin accounts. So it doesn't take very long for attackers to get initial access into an environment and then starting to achieve some of these action on objectives, right? Furthermore, you can even use other types of techniques, things like pass the hash, where I don't even need to crack these passwords. Once I'm in an environment, I could essentially take these password hashes, move them around to other systems in the environment, and then authenticate to those systems with just those password hashes. So back to the interpreter prompt here. I can type a shell command, and I can actually dump right into a Windows command shell. So right here, I'm in the System32 directory on John's machine. Then I can interact with John's machine just like I was sitting there at a Windows command prompt. Let's use PowerShell as an example. PowerShell is on every Windows machine by default. It's a very powerful administrative tool, but it's also great for attackers to leverage because it has such extensive capabilities. So attackers will often use PowerShell. A lot of customers that I work with obviously have PowerShell in their environment. Many don't know what PowerShell is actually doing. And if you ever get to a point where you're trying to disable PowerShell, for example, you'll find it nearly impossible because unfortunately, a lot of vendors may even leverage PowerShell to do even simple things like software updates, for example. So I'm going to use PowerShell in this case. I'm going to type out this full command here, and then we'll talk about what this is doing. vssadmin.exe, delete shadows, all quiet. So this is going to invoke Windows shadow copies, known as volume shadow copies. And as an attacker, I'm going to identify any volume shadow copies on John's machine and try to delete those shadow copies. Essentially, shadow copies is a built-in Windows function that takes snapshots of the machine. And you may see other EDR vendors, for example, tout their ability to roll back from a ransomware event. What they're really doing is leveraging Windows shadow copies to restore from a last known good configuration, so to speak, if files are encrypted. The problem with this is it's very resource intensive on the endpoint. And as we see here, attackers know this very well. So in a lot of cases, actually, I would say in just about 100% of cases of ransomware, if you look at the attack chain, prior to the ransomware detonation, the encryption, are attackers performing techniques like this one, known as inhibit system recovery, essentially deleting shadow copies, right? Preventing your capability to roll back from those ransomware events. At this point, I could assume if I'm an attacker, I've targeted John's machine, I've gotten some system level access, got some passwords and password hashes, maybe exfiltrated data, deleted shadow copies. I could then move to the point where maybe I want to upload ransomware to the system. And as you can see here, I can simply type an upload command, use this lockbit.exe that I've got stored on my machine to John's machine, and then I could execute that ransomware on John's machine. So Lockbit is a infamous ransomware variant. And actually, if you look at any recent news items, it's one that's making a big comeback. But essentially what we've seen here is initial access into the environment, full action on objectives before we finally get to the point where the ransomware is actually deployed. So let's go back here real quick. I'm going to go back to the slideshow and talk about some information that I think is going to be relevant to us. Tactics and techniques and procedures. Tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs. These are essentially terms that we use commonly in the space today in cybersecurity. And it's important for us to understand these. They're essentially military terms that we've adopted for cybersecurity. At the bottom of this screen here, this slide, you see the attack kill chain as well. So real quick, tactics are the overarching tactical operations that attackers are using. When we get into talking about techniques, you see the icon here, the envelope with the hook through it. So phishing would be a common technique. And then when we get into procedures, that is understanding from a hands-on keyboard perspective a lot of times, exactly what attackers are doing. And then the comment that I made about the attack chain. What we see at the bottom of this slide is the classic Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. It's been around for decades, and it's a quick and easy way to understand an attacker's attack operations from start to finish. So starting with reconnaissance, moving through things like weaponization, delivering those things like we saw being delivered to John, exploiting those machines, installing tools, establishing command and control, and then taking those action on objectives. So that's the classic kill chain that's been around for a long time. And essentially, the MITRE attack framework takes the kill chain to the next level. The MITRE attack framework is a vendor agnostic industry standard. And every security vendor should be incorporating and adopting the MITRE attack framework into their security mechanisms. We do here at Fortinet, which I'll show you. But I think it's important to understand that when you look at this framework, now that we understand what the enemy is doing, we can then use this framework to essentially map our security defenses properly. So what I'm going to do is actually show us quickly the MITRE attack framework. I'm going to share my screen again. If you haven't visited this before, this is one that you should definitely bookmark. So the MITRE attack framework is at attack.mitre.org. And as you can see here, the top of each column header, these are the specific tactics or the tactics that we see attackers using today. As you can see, this is much more extensive than what we see in that classic cyber kill chain. And then below each of these tactics are specific techniques. So for example, under reconnaissance, I have a list of different techniques, including something like search open website and domains. And you'll notice that there is a bar here on the right-hand side. I can open this to show sub-techniques, something like social media, for example. So if you think back to our example with John, I painted the picture that somebody called John on a Friday afternoon as he was wrapping up his first week on the job. Well, they may have known to target John specifically by doing some reconnaissance on something like LinkedIn, right? They know exactly who John's working for, when he started the job, what position he's in, what kind of skills, what kind of software systems he might be using. So this is a simple way for attackers to do reconnaissance. And the MITRE ATT&CK framework gives us information in that regard. I'm actually going to skip to the very end here and get down to the impact tactic. Below that, we have a technique known as inhibit system recovery. So if I click on inhibit system recovery, it's actually going to take me to a page that clearly explains what this technique is. And we see the first paragraph listed here. Adversaries may delete or remove built-in data and turn off services designed to aid in the recovery of a corrupted system to prevent recovery. A little bit further down, we actually get the specific procedures, including this one listed here. vssadmin.exe can be used to delete all volume shadow copies on a system. vssadmin.exe delete shadows all quiet. So tactics, techniques, and procedures. These are all categorized and cataloged from real world threat actors. So this is not theoretical information. So as security practitioners, we have the benefit of this knowledge base to make sure that we can fully understand exactly what attackers are doing. If you scroll down each of these pages, you'll even see procedural examples. Like I said, these are real world cataloged events. So you will typically see the names of prominent threat groups listed here. If I scroll down to the bottom of this one, for example, let's identify this one, WannaCry, one of the most infamous ransomwares of all time. And you can see here that WannaCry uses vssadmin along with other tools to disable operating system recovery features. So not only do we have good information, the nice thing about the MITRE ATT&CK framework is it also gives us guidance on how to mitigate threats and how to detect various threats as well. So as we look at the tools that we have in our environment, we can then say, okay, this maps to this technique, right? So we can start identifying what we have at our disposal, make sure that we have the proper pieces in place from a blocking and a tackling standpoint. All right. In regards to how we're defending against a lot of these advanced tactics and techniques from a Fortinet perspective, I like to speak towards this slide, essentially what we call our AI-driven SecOps platform. Defense in depth is very key. If you've heard that term before, it's still very much prevalent and very much applicable. The ability to build out defenses that are not just singular in focus, but are actually across the entire attack chain, right? So from a Fortinet perspective, if you look at the bottom of that slide, all of the things in red, what we would call our first line of defense, are the things that Fortinet is typically known for, right? Like next generation firewalls. Everybody knows us as a FortiGate company, as the largest firewall vendor in the world. So those types of protections are your first line of defense, so to speak. And then to the far left in the middle, you see reference to a data lake. So essentially with a lot of customers, we're feeding detections into a centralized location. That would be FortiAnalyzer or FortiSIEM, for example. Once we have these centralized logs, we can then raise up correlated alerts. And then the defense in depth that you see there lists out the attack surface, right? And then within the Fortinet product portfolio, which is extensive, we essentially have coverage across the board. So from an endpoint perspective, right, we'll be talking about FortiEDR in a moment. You've got our FortiClient EMS. Networking, right? Something like an NDR, network detection and response. You could deploy Fortinet NDR into your environment to get a visibility into the east-west traffic that's happening. Obviously, cloud protection, mail. I tell everybody you have to have some kind of spam solution, right? You need to have a mail solution. Our newest iteration of our mail product includes workspace protection, data, right? A lot of customers that I work with these days are taking a look at FortiDLP, the ability to see extensive information on endpoints, whether that's applications on the endpoint or even the use of SaaS applications, things like ChatGPT, right? And then being able to block or alert if somebody puts sensitive information into one of these AI models, right? And then attack surface management with things like FortiRecon, FortiDeceptor, which I will talk briefly about here in a moment. But I did want to talk briefly about FortiEDR to put some focus on what we saw with John specifically and how we are doing protection at the endpoint, or some of the things that you should be thinking about when you are thinking about endpoint protection. Real quick note on our EDR, which is also our XDR, and if we get into a managed discussion, our MDR. Essentially, it's a very lightweight agent, and it is comprised of two different capabilities. One is pre-execution protection, which is a next generation antivirus, not signature based, using machine learning algorithms on the endpoint to essentially look at potential malicious files and make the determination in milliseconds if it's good or bad. And then after that is post-execution protection, where we get into actually talking about EDR capabilities, right? Defending against the advanced tactics and techniques that we see in today's threat landscape across the board, comprehensive protection with orchestrated incident response. So the ability not just to respond on the endpoint itself, but the ability to extend our response capabilities within our existing tool set. So let's take a quick look at what this looks like in action. I'll switch over to FortiEDR. I'm going to show you our console. All right, let me find an incident here. As I pull this up, you're going to see a list of different incidents that should look readily familiar or vaguely familiar based on what we saw with John Locke. For example, the Windows update.exe. So let me find an interesting incident here, then we'll dig into it. All right, let's investigate this incident real quick. I'm going to explain this to you. So we're at the events incidents window, and up here in the upper left-hand corner, you can clearly see that we're looking at an event from Windows update.exe, which was the file that John downloaded to his machine. As we are looking at, there's the name of John's machine, the Flame, right? So this is the actual event from what was happening with John that I showed in the demo. And we can even see the path here to that Windows update.exe. There's John's username, jlock. This file does reside in his downloads folder. One of the nice things that we do right off the bat is give you visual representation of what is happening so you can clearly understand what you're looking at from start to finish. So reading from left to right in this middle pane, we see, for example, the timeline of events. Windows Explorer is where John downloaded that file, that Windows update.exe file. And then interestingly enough, once he detonated or executed that file, it created a child process. In this case, one called cloud.exe, which started making a connection to a public IP address. So this is what that classic command and control actually looks like on an endpoint. If we visualize this, we have a user downloading a file, executing that file, other processes are running, and then they are making a connection out to this command and control server. So this IP address that we see down here would be that attacker's command and control server, right? I showed you that Kali Linux running in my lab environment. That was my command and control server, right? So this would be the IP address of an attacker. I also want to point out, you can see MITRE tagging right here within the FortiEDR console. So this M, for example, that's the MITRE logo. If I click on this, we actually list out specific tactics and techniques that we're identifying during this process chain. right? Some of the things that we already saw. So we've got privilege escalation, right? Defense evasion. And this is why I start with that discussion on the MITRE ATT&CK framework. You should be taking the information, what you know from MITRE ATT&CK, and it should be incorporated into the various tool sets, right? So if you're looking at your current tool sets, you should see reference to MITRE ATT&CK. Or if you're evaluating new tool sets, they should reference that as well. Once again, this is industry standard. So SOC analysts are using this all the time. It gives you context and awareness of exactly what is happening within your environment. Now, in this particular case, we see John doing something he shouldn't do. He clicks on something that he shouldn't click on. Obviously, we can block this on John's endpoint. But what I really want to focus on is understanding the context of an attack like this, and then being able to respond as quickly as possible, properly. So if we see an IP address being contacted, this command and control server, obviously we want to prevent this on John's machine. But what if John isn't the only target within our organization, which is common. If we see someone actually targeting an organization, they're typically not going to just pick one target. Or if there's other devices in our environment that may not have the ability to run protection software on them, right? Commonly, DVR systems. A lot of customers in manufacturing and OT environments, you don't have the capability or the ability to put endpoint protection software on those devices. We still need to protect the environment in that regard. So I want to draw your attention here to an entry here that says one incident response. If I expand this, I'll read this. It's a little bit small, but essentially says that this IP address was added as a malicious IP address on a firewall. In my case, it's a FortiGate that's running in my environment, but even with FortiEDR, we can do integrations to other third-party firewalls, commonly things like Cisco, Palo Alto, Checkpoint, not a problem. But what we see here is that automated orchestrated incident response that I mentioned. It's not good enough just to diffuse this on a single endpoint. We need to take automated response actions in real time. So in this case, when we're contacting malicious IP addresses, known command and control or known botnet IP addresses, it makes sense to block these at the firewall, right? So as you look at the current state of your environment and think of things from a SecOps perspective, start thinking about these automated response actions. These are critical for what we're talking about with customers on a daily basis to make sure that we can diffuse these attacks before they turn into those ransomware events, right? Because like we saw with John, attackers get initial access, perform all kinds of operations before they ever get to the point where they finally deploy that ransomware. That's what we see in the news, but there's a lot of stuff that happens prior to the ransomware deployment where we could have stopped the attacker. And in this case, if we can stop them from communicating with the command and control server right away, we can prevent those attacks and the devastating damage that we see subsequently coming from a ransomware event. So let's move back here and talk real quick about SOC as a service. So obviously within Fortinet, I'll show you, we've got a lot of different point products, different solutions. We work with customers to build out enterprise level SOCs all the time. What you see on this slide is on the left-hand side, what a typical enterprise SOC operation might look like when we work with customers to implement things like a SIEM as a data lake, using threat intelligence, using SOAR, security orchestration and automation to then automate a lot of functionality. But a lot of our customers don't have the kind of infrastructure to support a full-blown SOC, let alone trying to staff that SOC, right? So we offer managed services as well. In this case, our SOC as a service. What you see here is essentially those pieces of the puzzle, but from a managed perspective, using things like FortiAnalyzer Cloud. And then you get the benefit of essentially having a SOC team at your disposal. You can see on the slide here, different metrics involved with that. It's very easy to deploy. Leverages things like FortiGuard Labs, which is our threat intelligence piece. And then what I'll show you is the ability to acknowledge and respond to alerts in very short amounts of time, just like we were talking about with John and trying to do those automated incident response actions, right? So the ability to detect, respond, obviously improve on your security operations without having to go out, hire a SOC analyst, staff a SOC, all of those types of things. So real benefit, real immediate return on value for anybody that wants to essentially take advantage of a managed service like SOC as a service. So let's take a quick look at what this looks like from a managed security perspective. Essentially, when you subscribe to our SOC as a service, which can start with something as little as just taking telemetry from your FortiGates, but we can also then start layering in telemetry from things like FortiEDR, like I just showed you, FortiClient, other pieces, SASE, for example, feeding into our SOC, generating alerts for you, and then we can notify you of events. You have access to a cloud dashboard that you see here. The main thing that I want to point out right away, the most important piece, is in the upper right-hand corner for some metrics. This is over a 30-day period. What we see here is 6.7 million process logs. Of those 6.7 million logs, 82 of those were security events. And then of those 82 security events, our team triaged 3 of those. Those were alerts. Of those 3 triaged alerts, 1 alert was escalated to a customer. So what we find commonly, feedback that I get from customers, is as you start deploying security solutions, even something as simple as a next-gen firewall, right? It generates lots of activity. And in my experience, even working from a penetration testing standpoint, customers don't have the time to sift through those logs, or commonly, which some of you may be able to relate to, is the fact that you just turn off some of these alerts, right? There's just so much information that's coming at you. You just turn those things off. Essentially, we do the heavy lift for you. So on the back end of this, you're actually getting the benefit of our SOAR platform, which is automating a lot of capabilities to then filter down to our SOC analysts actionable information that they can then investigate, and then when necessary, escalate to you. So if you're worried about your security, for example, the amount of information that's being thrown at you, in perspective, if you could say, okay, within the last 30 days, I've been fully protected and I've had to deal with 1 escalation, right? One thing that absolutely needed my attention. Our SOC team has eyes on glass 24/7. We're filtering this through our SOAR platform. Our analysts are triaging you and then engaging you when you need to be engaged. So it gives you peace of mind, and it cuts down on the amount of noise that you encounter on a regular basis. I'm going to show you real quick. This is an example of an email that you might get from our SOC as a service team. Simply says, hey, you've got a new alert that needs to be reviewed. You should access your portal, and here's alert ID. I'm going to go ahead and copy this alert ID just to show you what one of these looks like. Let's search for this particular alert. And here we have alert ID 284057, some kind of malware event. So here's the alert, and we've got information on the malware itself, detected by FortiGate AV. We give you a description. In this case, there's been some kind of malware downloaded, and there's IP addresses associated with this, analysis and recommendation. So here's a quick analysis of exactly what this particular threat is, and then what you should do to take action. At the bottom of this, we have correlating information. So obviously, IP addresses associated with this particular detection. So, hey, these were detected downloading this particular file. You should take a look at these. If you're using whatever EDR you have, go ahead and scan those. Obviously, if you're using something like FortiEDR or MDR team, our team would already be doing this for you. Indicators associated with this particular event, things like file hashes, right? So you can then cross-reference this with free services like VirusTotal to better understand the endpoints involved, assets. In this case, this asset was a FortiGate. So we would, if you had multiple FortiGates, you could see which FortiGate these sat behind for these detections. And then lastly, on the right-hand side, you have a way to communicate with the SOC analyst, right? So you're not logging into a separate portal, opening a support ticket. You actually can interact with our team asynchronously. This isn't like a live chat, but you would go back and forth with the SOC analyst who is generating this alert. So you could have context and conversation. And it may just be as simple as, hey, we went ahead and scanned this. Looks like we're clean. Can you confirm that you're no longer seeing this activity on our side? So one of the biggest benefits, one of the biggest bonuses for customers we have feedback-wise is the fact that they can interact with the analyst to make sure that they understand exactly what they're looking at and have full, complete control and insight into what's happening in their environment. I'm going to head back to the slide deck real quick. This is what I'm going to essentially end with here is when we're talking about bringing this all together with SecOps, right? So that attack sequence that I mentioned. You see along the top here, essentially that cyber kill chain, the Lockheed Martin kill chain. I condensed it. Obviously, don't need to map everything directly to MITRE ATT&CK, so to speak, but I've broken this down into two sections. On the left-hand side, we've got pre-attack during the reconnaissance and weaponization. That would typically be where attackers haven't engaged with you directly yet. And traditionally, there wasn't a whole lot that we could do about that, right? However, utilizing services like FortiRecon, we can actually go and monitor the dark web on your behalf, right? We could actually do some attack surface monitoring to find out what kind of vulnerabilities exist for your environment. So you can start to be proactive in that regard. And then MITRE ATT&CK, once we get into delivery, exploitation, installation, etc., these are an idea of some of the products within our portfolio that could fill these gaps. Now, I throw these up here as examples. I don't throw these up here to say, hey, this product is the one you need, and if you get this, you're fully covered. If you remember going back to when I said defense in depth, right? Defense in depth. So take your current tool set, map it to this kill chain, and you can identify where maybe gaps exist. And for example, if you don't have a mail solution, well, from a delivery method, you should have some kind of mail solution in addition to something like an EDR, right? And then as you mature through your security posture, you might get to the point where you need a full-fledged SIEM. You need a full-fledged SOAR, right? So this can give us some guidance. And at the bottom there, some of the implementation management services that we can provide, SOC as a service, managed detection and response for the endpoint, and then incident response. I tell people if you're in a good spot, you feel like you've got a mature security posture, definitely consider incident response services. Have something on retainer for that point in time where something happens that you didn't expect. And the last thing you want to do during an event like a ransomware event is to be scrambling to find somebody to come in and do incident response for you. We provide those services as well, and you can use those for the break glass situations, or even to do some proactive things like tabletop exercises, penetration testing, red team exercises, right? Those aren't hours that you have to dedicate to just response if they expire. So we can pretty much cover the gamut for you. Make sure you cover all of your bases. And then, like I said, with the information that we learn from understanding, knowing what the enemy is doing, hopefully that will inform us enough that we can get the proper security measures in place, make sure that we're fully protected and ready to go in case of any kind of assault from attackers. So that's where I'm going to wrap up this presentation and leave a few minutes here at the end. If we've got any questions that we haven't been able to answer in the chat up till now, I'll be happy to take any of those questions.
Thanks so much, Jason. That was excellent. We do have some questions from our audience. A lot of us are stuck with legacy systems. How do you modernize security operations around that?
Great question. Legacy systems are something that we actually specialize. Let's say, for example, I've talked a lot about EDR. It's actually a perfect posture for us. Our EDR, I mentioned before, is very lightweight and it's backwards compatible. We can actually install our EDR all the way back to Windows XP systems, Server 2003 systems. There's multiple reasons for that. We do have patented technologies. So that is a gap that we can fill. And we actually have a lot of uptake in things like manufacturing environments where some of those legacy systems are prevalent. And then I would also look at some of the things that aren't necessarily dependent on the legacy or the status of your systems. Things like deception technology. FortiDeceptor is essentially something that we can deploy into your environment. Same thing with FortiNDR. It's essentially just looking at network traffic that's happening on the wire. So if By using some of those things, even our SIM technology, which can start taking logs from essentially anything and everything, look to take advantage of some of those different solutions. Definitely have some conversations with your account management team about what we can do on that front to fill any gaps that you may think you're not able to fill because you do have some of those legacy systems.
Here's another question. What's an area most companies overlook that could make a big difference in threat detection?
I would say the first one is threat intelligence. So if you think of everything that I've been talking about, like with MITRE ATT&CK, threat intelligence means understanding what those attacks are, how attackers are operating, and then putting that threat intelligence into your security stack. So I've mentioned a couple of times FortiGuard Labs. FortiGuard Labs is our threat intelligence arm. Essentially, if you think of the FortiGates, like I mentioned, we're the largest manufacturer, deployer of firewalls worldwide without even a close second. Every one of those firewalls is acting as a security sensor, right? In addition to the other things that we have deployed, like FortiEDR, FortiNDR. All of that telemetry funnels back to FortiGuard Labs. We also take additional feeds from third-party vendors, but then FortiGuard Labs itself will natively enrich a lot of our products. So if we even go back to that FortiEDR screen that I showed you, that IP address that was being contacted, that we blocked on the firewall, well, we're just, randomly blocking IP addresses, but we're using that threat intelligence to inform the decisions that we're making. So look for threat intelligence that's being incorporated into the tools that you use today, or look at the capability that those tools might have to actually ingest threat intelligence feeds. So take advantage of what is out there, so to speak. Lots of people, like I said, FortiGuard Labs doing a lot of good work. Use that information to enrich what you have at your disposal to essentially extend the capabilities of your tools.
That's great. All right, Jason, what's the biggest challenge that you've seen for public sector teams, specifically when it comes to security operations?
That's another great question. A couple of things that come to mind immediately. First is automation and then staffing, which, really goes hand in hand with what we've been talking about. I see a lot of great tools being deployed and in use, right? Without any kind of crosstalk or automation. So that's a big one. That's why we're having a lot of conversations with customers around the Fortinet security fabric, and why I find more and more customers are open to having more of a single vendor discussion, right? It used to be, hey, I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket, which makes sense. I get it. And I've been there myself. But when you start looking at the time it takes for attackers to achieve some of these action on objectives, the automation becomes very critical. And a lot of times the best way to achieve that automation is through some kind of single vendor solution, right? That's why at Fortinet, we do have such a big portfolio. At one point in time, Gartner was creating, some kind of documentation around this mindset of being single vendor focused, right? So automation, think about how your current tools either work together or don't work together, and then explore opportunities that you have to make them actually synchronize, right? Like I've said, I've mentioned multiple times, attackers being able to be pretty quick. I haven't talked about AI up until this point. I'm kind of, I think a lot of people are over just hearing the term AI, although it's a necessary discussion. The biggest thing that I see with the use of AI today from an attacker's perspective is the speed in which they're able to accomplish some of their attacks. So to throw out another term that you may or may not have heard of is something called breakout time, which essentially is the time it takes from an attacker to get initial access into your environment. So think of that scenario with John Locke. So access to John Locke's machine, what's the breakout time for me to get from John Locke's machine to something else within your environment, right? Something that we might call lateral movement. The use of AI by attackers is greatly increasing the breakout time that we see, right? That's why I said it's critical for us to have these automated response actions. So think of it in that terms. AI, the problem from an attacker's perspective, or the problem that we face, is the speed in which they can take action on objective. And then the other side of that, staffing. Obviously, as we look at this, I hope that this has been informative and educational to look at something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? Say, okay, I've got a great reference point that can inform my decisions, help me evaluate what I'm using, understand what attackers are doing. Still, that's a lot of information, right? And if you find people that are very good at it and very skilled, they're typically selling their services to the highest bidder, so to speak, right? Most level 1 SOC analysts that get trained up and get really good don't stay with, just a single small entity, right? They'll go work for some of the different vendors, some of the different managed service providers, right? So the ability to have some of those people on staff, have them competent and trained, is problematic because they're difficult to retain. So that's why we wanted to touch on the SOC as a service today. Once again, a lot of customers that I talk to these days are more receptive than ever to staff augmentation because of this reality with the skills gap, so to speak. So that's a very long response, but automation, staffing, SOC augmentation, those would be the two key areas that I would say.
Thanks, Jason. I think that's a really good segue into our next question here. We're a smaller IT team, right? No surprise. How can we start using AI without adding a bunch of complexity to our security operations?
Okay, yeah. So AI conversation, this is one that a lot of people are wrestling with. And, I feel like a lot of people are almost at the point where they say, I've got to use AI. Everybody's talking about it, right? I would say, once again, take a look at the tools that you have currently and see if they incorporate AI. If you're evaluating new tools, see if they incorporate AI. And typically what you're talking about is generative AI, essentially being able to assist you in what you're doing on a day-to-day basis using natural language, right? So look for that integration with the tools and then the ability to use natural language. Even if we get into a console like we were looking at, and you see some IP addresses being contacted, the ability to just say, is this IP address a malicious IP address? Or what can you tell me about this IP address? You can definitely go down a rabbit hole with AI and some of the capabilities, some of the use cases, but I would leverage and rely on vendors incorporating those tools into the tool sets for you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jason. That's time for today. So appreciate so much you sharing your expertise. And folks, if you have any questions that come up in the meantime, feel free to get in touch with your dedicated account team, or you can find us, of course, at Fortinet.com. So that concludes for today. I want to thank you all so much for attending. I hope you found this session informative and useful. Just a few quick items before you go today. As a reminder, today's session was recorded. You'll receive a copy in your inbox shortly. And again, please make use of some of those free resources on your screen so you can learn more about Fortinet's solution, market trends, some of our recommendations. We do plan to do more public sector focused events in 2026. So on that note, you should see a survey pop up on your screen. And to help us improve, please go ahead and answer the questions you see listed so that we can deliver more relevant content and events for you in the future. All right. Thanks again so much for joining, folks. Stay safe, everyone.